Welcome. This is the Traveling Designer Podcast. My name is Rick Oberreiter, and I am your host. And this is episode 3. I come to you from a place called Carter Lake, which is a little bit south of Fort Collins, Colorado. So I feel like a lot's happened since episode 2. I was in the Sequoia National Park area. I then drove my camper from there all the way back to Bend, Oregon, where I had a Subaru stored there, and I swapped out my camper for my Subaru and then drove to Colorado. I lived here for 15 years, so it's good to be back in the Rocky Mountains and to see my friends. So I'm going to be, car camping and tent camping for the next 5 weeks. So we'll see how that goes. In my head, it's going to be a romantic and cool thing, but we will see. So yeah, let's get to it and jump to the topic for episode 3. The last episode I actually recorded from my campsite in Sequoia National Forest, and the next day I took my first hike in the area, and I pretty much knew what I wanted to talk about as soon as I did that hike. So I named the podcast episode Artists, National Parks, and How We All Fit In. And it's a little broad, but I'm just going to kind of jump in, kind of start with the hike and just kind of go, and you guys can all figure it out as I go. But so the next day I was doing this hike, and the goal was to go to this place called the Booley Tree. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but the Booley Tree is the largest sequoia tree in the Sequoia National Forest. And actually I just learned it's the 6th largest sequoia tree in the world. So you go through this place called the Converse Basin, and the Converse Basin is actually the second largest sequoia grove in the world. So, actually, you can drive the first part of this trail, but the road was closed, so I hiked it, which is even better anyway. So you're, walking through, and, it's kind of like the old growth and old forests, and you start to see the sequoia trees. One of the first things you do notice is that most of the sequoias are, they're babies. They're younger sequoias. They're like 100, 200 years old. Not the big ones that most people would think of. And you kind of keep walking. And it is beautiful, like I said. Then you come out to a place called Stump Meadow. As you start walking, you see a few of what used to be the big trees, and they're just stumps now. And then you come, like I said, to Stump Meadow, and this is dozens upon dozens upon dozens of stumps. And these are the big sequoias, the sequoias that are 2,000-3,000 years old. And I don't know, maybe it was fitting that the day I did the hike, it was very foggy. A lot of times I can only see, 10 feet in front of me, but there's just stumps, all over, dozens and dozens. So I don't know, it's something that just kind of gets you thinking. There's a placard, that starts talking about the logging that happened in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and that most of these old sequoia trees are now gone. So yeah, it's something that, you definitely notice, and it definitely got me thinking about things. So then that next day, I did a hike, same grove, opposite side, and it was called the Chicago Stump. And another really beautiful hike, and you come across, and this stump, even the stump was impressive, but this particular tree was 3,200 years old when it was cut down, and the story kind of goes, I think it was like someone who had money, kind of bought rights to the tree, and he cut the tree down for the 1893 Chicago's World's Fair. So he cut the tree down, shipped it to Chicago, and put the tree back up again. Pretty crazy. So how do you think the people of the fair responded to this tree? They actually, called it the California hoax. People didn't think that a tree of that magnitude or that big could exist. So think about that for a second. There are people here, people in California who not only know of these big trees, but are cutting them down in droves and droves, and then the rest of the country can't even fathom that something like this could even exist. So I know it's pretty interesting. This was the late 1800s, so I'm not going to sit here and, blame those people for cutting down all the trees, but it is a little sad. Most of these lumber companies, didn't make money. A lot of them went out of business, and they were actually saying that only 50% of the sequoia trees actually made it to the mill. A lot of these trees, the sequoias, they cut them down and they hit the ground and they just shatter. Because they're so big, and the wood is just different. It's a more of a fragile wood than some other trees, so it would just shatter. So they were saying that most of the wood that actually did make it to the mill only became fence posts. So I don't know if that was worth to cut down all these beautiful trees to build some fences, but that's what was going on at the late 1800s. But anyway, so thank God for people who had vision for the future. People like John Muir, who was called the father of the national parks. If you don't know much about him, do a quick, if you have some interest, you should Google him. He's a very interesting fellow. He was a Scottish immigrant. Him and his family, when he was young, settled in Wisconsin, and he started traveling. I mean, in his lifetime, he traveled the world, but he would start walking, and he eventually made it to California. And if you know much about him, you know that he just fell in love with California and really fell in love with the Sequoia area, and he spent some time living there, and definitely did lots of work to try to protect Sequoia, the whole Sequoia area. He also, he was called the father of the national parks, and he had direct involvement with creating Sequoia National Park, Mount Rainier, which is in Washington, Petrified Forest, which I believe is in Arizona, and Grand Canyon National Parks. So I mean, he did his monumental and a lot of this conservation stuff happening in the early 1900s. He lobbied successfully for the creation of Yosemite National Park in 1890, then asked for additional protection for the area before it was actually a national park through Theodore Roosevelt. And actually in 1901, Muir published a book called Our National Parks that brought the attention of Theodore Roosevelt. And in May of 1903, President Roosevelt camped with John Muir near Glacier Point, which is in the Sequoia National Park. And on that trip, Muir convinced Roosevelt to take control of the Yosemite Valley and the sequoia groves of that area and return it to the federal government. And in 1906, Roosevelt did precisely that, and that's when Yosemite became an official national park. So he was monumental in so much that happened, when it comes to the protection of national parks, national forests, all of that stuff throughout the West. Pretty interesting stuff. When I was a kid, I was lucky enough to go to Yellowstone and Tetons many times for family vacations. We had a Chevy Impala, and we had a conversion van that we would bring out, and we had an old pop-up camper. And we would come and camp out in the national parks. And one of the things that I remember and really enjoyed was at the end of the night, the rangers would have a program, and you go to the amphitheater, and they would have a big bonfire, and the rangers would talk about something to do with the national parks or with wildlife or something. And that was just something that I always really, really enjoyed, and something that I really remembered. So a few years back, when I was road tripping, I was in Crater Lake, and they had a ranger talk, and I made sure I went. And the talk was something that stuck with me. It was something, and the subject was talking about artists, especially photographers, and how they helped in the protection of many of the national parks. People like John Muir would take photographers to all these amazing places and have photographers take photos, and they would send these photos back to Washington to show all the the politicians and government officials these amazing, amazing places. And I don't know, for some reason that just really stuck with me. I'm a huge lover of the outdoors, and I'm also an artist myself. I went to art school in Denver, so it's like, combining two of the things that I really love the most, and there's something about artists that, going to art school and just being one myself and being around artists is like, we all have a different way that we see the world, right? A different skew. And I think artists have the ability to kind of convey, how they see the world. I don't think all of us have that ability, but artists have always, been ones to make us think, inspire us, challenge us, inform us. And, and now, I start to learn about how, they helped us see the beauty that we didn't even know existed for all these amazing places, back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And in actuality, even way before that. Sometimes think it's funny how we come across information, or maybe how information finds us. One of the things I like to do, I'm not a big consumer by any stretch of the imagination, but one of the things that I do like to collect are the press pennies that you get at, national parks and other like tourist places. You put in the 2 quarters, put in the penny, crank the thing, and it pops out like a little design. Another artist who created those. So I have a collection of those. I started collecting them as an adult. I actually never collected them much as a kid, and so I have a few of them. And I actually met a friend of mine. She also likes to collect them, and she was nice enough to send me one of the little, it's a little book that you can put all your pennies in. Kind of like you would do with baseball cards, but much smaller. But on the back of that, there was this little paragraph talking about an artist named George Catlin, and he was an artist, a painter, back in the 1830s, and his kind of specialty was he traveled the Great Plains, and he painted buffalo and Native Americans. And artists back in those days, they were kind of Renaissance men to a certain extent, because they went and they, not only painted or, took photos a little bit later, but they journaled and wrote books and did all kinds of different things. And, because a lot of the people, and at the time, a lot of these areas haven't been explored all that much. So, in the 1830s, he became acutely aware of the balance of nature was being, one part of nature was being destroyed. And what was happening was the people of the East really loved the skins of the buffalo. And it was a fashionable thing in the East back then. So lots of people in the East would come, and they would hire the Native Americans to go and kill the buffalo to get the hides. And, I guess by hire, I mean that they were basically trading liquor, whiskey, and such. So the Native Americans, started not to use the entire animal like they're accustomed to doing, and they would kill the buffalo and just let them rot in the sun and take them just so they could get the liquor. So, it's a little sad. So, but George Catlin realized that if this continued, that that the buffalo would actually become extinct. Something that, again, that wasn't thought about back then. So, but the point of the story is he was one of the first, maybe the first person to ever kind of come up with the concept of the national parks. And I think with every great concept, comes some tweaking, because his idea that he wrote in a book of his was that he wanted to take a bunch of land, and he was thinking the entire plains, kind of the Midwest, and and have it be controlled by the government, and people could come and not only see the buffalo roam in their natural habitat, but also the Native Americans. Yeah, so I don't agree with the part of people going to watch other people in a national park. But like I said, with every great idea comes some tweaking. So that was the first time that idea got planted. The first national park, Yellowstone, was created in 1872, and that had to do with a couple of artists as well. The Hayden expedition reported on the majestic scenery of the area and was vividly recorded and captured by 2 artists. One of them was a well-known photographer named William Henry Jackson, and another one was not a well-known, as a young painter named Thomas Moran. And in 1871, they set out to do a government survey of the land. And for 2 weeks, Moran filled a sketchbook with the stunning landscapes of Yellowstone. And with Jackson's photos and Moran's watercolors, there was the first kind of renderings of the time. Those were sent back to Congress, and the photographs were proof that some of the art. There's been some artists who did some stuff before that, but it was the photographs especially was proof that these places really existed. Places like Yosemite and Yellowstone and Grand Canyon were really established through photography and art. Artists created these images and put them out in the public, and they get repeated over and over again, and these become the established views of what we see. It really shapes how we see and understand these spaces. Other artists such as John Ferry, he was hired by the Great Northern Railroad to paint Glacier National Park. And Carlton E. Watkins, he photographed the Yosemite Valley, and this was back, in the 1830s, and some of his work helped convince Abraham Lincoln to sign and preserve the valley in 1864, way before John Muir was even in the area. And then there's the Cole brothers, and they took photos of the Grand Canyon, and they were the first to kind of explore the national park tourism by selling photos and leather-bound albums to tourists. They built a studio, actually, in 1906 at the canyon's rim, and even though they ran into some issues with the Park Service over the years, over various issues, the studio still stands today. And of course, there's Ansel Adams. He started taking photos of Yosemite in 1909, and even at an early age, took a really famous photo of Half Dome. In 1909, he joined the Sierra Club and spent the first of 4 summers in the Yosemite Valley working at the Memorial Lodge. So Adams was kind of like the artist that brought art and conservation together. Adams was an activist for the cause of wilderness and the environment. And over the years, he attended meetings, wrote thousands of letters in support of his conservation, philosophies, to newspaper editors, through the Sierra Club, to the Wilderness Society colleagues, governments, bureaucrats, politicians, anyone he could get in front of, but obviously, his influence came in his photography. His images became symbols, icons of wild America, back in the early 1900s. When people thought about national parks or nature or the environment itself, they often thought about them in terms of an Ansel Adams photograph. As I was doing some reading on Ansel Adams, I came across this little sentence that I thought was kind of cool. I thought I would read. It said, "His black and white images were not realistic documents of nature. He created a sense of sublime magnificence of nature that infused the viewer with the emotional equivalent of wilderness, often more powerful than the actual thing." It's just, Adams too, like Muir, was really ahead of his time. For Adams, the environmental issues of particular importance were Yosemite National Park, the national park system, and above all, the preservation of wilderness. He focused on what he termed was the spiritual, emotional aspects of parks and wilderness, and really resisted the parks' resortism that led to overdevelopment of the national parks. He fought for new parks and wilderness areas. He fought for the Wilderness Act, Wild Alaska, Big Sur, which is in Central California, the redwoods, endangered sea lions and sea otters, for clean water and clean air. He advocated for balance, restraint of resources. Adams also fought relentlessly against overbuilt highway systems, billboards, and other environmental short-sightedness. And while doing all of this, he treated his opponents with, respect and courtesy. Adams was commissioned by all kinds of companies to photograph national parks all over the country. As a member of the Sierra Club, advocated for the establishment of Kings Canyon National Park, a place that I was just at, that became reality in 1940, something that, John Muir wasn't even able to do years before, which is some pretty powerful stuff. When I was in the Tetons last year, I got up one morning to go. I like to get up really early and go look for wildlife, but I was coming down and there was a turnoff, and I didn't really know why I turned off there. It was just I wanted to get a view of the mountains, but it was an area where there's a famous photo that Ansel Adams took of the Snake River and the Tetons that kind of come up behind it, and you can stand in the exact same spot where he took that photo, and you can take that exact same photo. And, I think that right there is like the example of what they were trying to achieve, right? Like, you can sit there and, I mean, obviously, for the most part, you're taking the exact same photo he took. And obviously you can see how, nature has changed over 100 plus years, but the fact that you can take, take that same exact photo is showing that the work that all these people put in over all those years, is really, paying off. So I guess the last part of this is like, what does that mean for today? Obviously, there's still artists doing work for the park. You walk in any, gift shop, and all the, the postcards and the shirts and everything are done by artists. Besides the pressed pennies thing I said before, another thing that I do like to collect are those national parks posters, and that was done by a photographer and graphic designer named Rob Decker, who also worked under Ansel Adams in Yosemite back in the 1940s. And most of the art, when it pertains to national parks today, is geared more towards conservation and further protection, more than just merely showing the beauty of the national parks in general. So maybe trying to come full circle a little bit, when I was in Kings Canyon a few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to go back to one of those ranger presentations or programs, and the topic of conversation was bringing big wildlife back into habitats in which they at one time inhabited. So one of the examples was when they decided to bring the wolves back into the Teton or Yellowstone in like the mid 1990s, and there's a lot of people who were a little worried about bringing them back in because they were predators and they thought they would just kind of kill everything, but back, during the time the elk population was way up, and they were destroying lots of the grasslands, and the rivers were changing, so they thought it was important to try, and they were amazed of what happened. So they bring the wolves back in, and they brought the elk population down, and the prairies and the grasslands started recovering, and the rivers actually went back to their natural form, and the riverbanks healed, and that brought in beavers and brought in other animals, and brought in fish and birds, and they thought it was amazing what transpired in all of that. And I bring this up because like the ecosystem, it's all interconnected. As Ansel Adams said, we're all connected. We're all connected to these places, and it's our responsibility to protect them, so our children can see them, and our children's children can not only enjoy them, but also learn from all of the national parks and the wilderness and everything that the wilderness has to teach us. But I also think that interconnectedness has to deal with the fact that it's our responsibility to make sure we have, clean air, clean water, and overall this is a clean earth to live in. So get out there and do things, enjoy. Go to the national parks, or go get a parks pass, and go camp, and try to support and do what you can. Go to the lake on the weekends. And when it comes to to all these issues, if it's the national parks or nature in general, is I think to realize that to try to see all these things as human beings. It might sound a little weird, but I think we all have to understand the world we live in, or especially the United States we live in right now, and just to see the issues as they are, and the greatest thing that we have is the ability to be free thinkers. And one of the greatest parts about living in the country that we live in is the fact that we have the ability to express those thoughts, and have all the resources we need at our fingertips. So if you have a passion for something, if it's nature or whatever it is, go in and do the work and do the research and do the best job you can do to come up with the best decisions that you can. Talk to people that have different viewpoints than you, and start discussions, because all those things help us compile information that we need to make good decisions. For things that are happening now and things that are going to be happening for future generations. All right, that was a little off topic, but basically the main point is get out there and enjoy. Get out and enjoy everything, and bypass, go camping. If you can't do that, the National Parks Foundation is a great organization that helps allocate some money to the national parks. One of the things I enjoy doing is designing T-shirts. I often say that's, not the sexiest shirt you're ever going to buy, but it will help, the national parks, as I will give some of the money to the National Parks Foundation. So you can find my T-shirt collection through my website. So those are the main things. So, I want to thank everyone for listening, and thank you to all the artists out there who are out there doing great work and, out there informing us and inspiring us and challenging us every day to get out of our comfort zone and to push our viewpoints and to continue to challenge us. All right, so 2 quick points before we sign off. I don't know if I mentioned this at the beginning, but I'm doing the podcast actually from my tent, and it really started to rain, so hopefully the raindrops didn't affect the hearing too much. That maybe adds to the ambiance a little bit. And also I made one point about John Muir as well, where I think I said something about the sequoia, where he loved the sequoias, and obviously, but he spent a lot of his time in Yosemite. That is where he really fell in love. So I just wanted to make sure that I brought that, I said that really quickly. So, as usual, I like to, end with a quote, and this is something I feel like really ties everything together really well. And it's from Theodore Roosevelt, and it goes something like this: "There can be nothing in this world more beautiful than Yosemite, the girls of the giant sequoias and redwoods, the canyon of the Colorado, the canyon of the Yellowstone, the Three Tetons. And our people should see it, that they are all preserved for their children and their children's children forever, with their majestic beauty all unmarred." So I think that's an excellent quote. So I think, like I said, kind of brings everything completely full circle. So I want to thank everyone for listening. This was a challenging episode for me to kind of, I was bringing a lot of information and learning. I learned so much in trying to, pass on some information. So it was a little bit something different. So I hope, you learned as much as I did and enjoyed it. And until next time, I thank you again, and get out there and explore. To listen to all the episodes and to read my blog, go to www.travelingdesigner.co. That's www.travelingdesigner.co.